It began in the early spring of 1834 in the remote, hilly woods of eastern Kentucky, near a forgotten settlement called Mill Creek Hollow. It wasn't the kind of place where news traveled fast. There were no papers, no telegrams, and no real roads to speak of. But what happened there that year would echo through generations, not because it was widely reported, but because those who witnessed it never forgot. This is the story of Silas and Elijah Whitlock, twins born on the last day of February, during a storm so fierce it tore the iron bell from the church tower in Clay County. Their mother, a young woman named Lydia Whitlock, was barely 20 and alone when she gave birth. Her husband, Abel, had been killed months earlier in a logging accident. His body never recovered from the river where it vanished beneath the winter ice. She gave birth in silence in a one-room log cabin with only her aging neighbor, Miss Edna Brewster, to help her. The twins came into the world under the howl of wind and the flicker of oil lanterns. Edna would later say she'd never seen babies born with eyes so dark and so wide. Like they'd been watching the world long before they arrived in it, she said. At first, the boys seemed like any other twins, identical in every way, but as the months passed, the differences began to show. Silas was silent, always watching. Elijah was loud, always laughing. Silas learned to walk months before his brother. Elijah spoke before Silas ever made a sound. They were two sides of the same coin, and yet their mother insisted they moved like one. When Elijah cried, Silas would flinch. When Silas was hurt, Elijah would weep inconsolably. When they turned 5, their names started appearing in whispered conversations across Mill Creek Hollow. In the spring of 1839, the boys were sent to the tiny log schoolhouse that served the nearby farming families. Their teacher, Miss Catherine Hale, a stern but fair woman from Virginia, was the first outsider to observe what she called the Whitlock phenomenon. According to her journal, which was found decades later, the boys could not be separated. When she once sat them at different ends of the room, Elijah collapsed with a nosebleed and Silas fainted. When she tried to discipline Silas with a ruler for misbehavior, Elijah clutched his own hand and screamed in pain, though he hadn't been touched. She wrote, "There's something between them, not affection. No, it is deeper. It's as if they are bound not by blood alone, but by soul, a string tied tight between their minds." The community thought it strange, but not sinister. Many simply called it twin intuition, until the fire. On an October night in 1843, the Whitlock cabin burned to the ground. Lydia died in the blaze. The boys, now 9, were found in the field across the creek, miles away from the cabin, standing side by side in their nightclothes, soaked in rain. Neither spoke for days. When they did, both gave the same account, word for word, as if rehearsed. "We woke at the same time. We heard our mother's voice saying, 'Run,' and we ran." They were taken in by a farmer named Malcolm Graves, who lived with his wife, Harriet, and their 3 daughters on the edge of town. The Graves family tried to treat the boys as their own, but the events that followed would fracture their home and haunt them forever. By the age of 12, Silas and Elijah displayed knowledge no child should possess. And not just reading or writing, but foreign languages they'd never been taught. Latin, ancient Greek, even bits of Cherokee dialect. One of the Graves' daughters, 17-year-old Charlotte, swore she heard Silas whispering to the fire in the hearth, and the flames had risen higher with every word. Harriet Graves claimed she awoke one night to find Elijah standing over her bed, silently weeping, his eyes blank. When she asked what was wrong, he simply said, "I dreamed your sister died." The next morning, they received a letter from Virginia. Harriet's sister had passed in her sleep the same night. Still, despite the strangeness, the boys were never cruel, never violent, but their presence carried a weight, like being in a room with a thunderstorm just out of sight. In 1847, a traveling physician named Dr. Horace Tillingham passed through Mill Creek Hollow. A man of science and curiosity, he'd heard whispers of the Whitlock twins during his time in Lexington. He requested to examine them, not physically, but neurologically. He spent 3 days with the boys. His final report, preserved in the archives of a private university, contained the following statement: "I have seen many twins, I have seen many marvels of the human mind, but nothing compares to what I observed in these boys. They answered questions in perfect unison without consulting one another. One drew a circle with chalk in the barn while the other, blindfolded, traced the exact same shape into the dirt half a mile away. Their pulses beat at the same rhythm. When one's heart accelerated under stress, the others did the same. I do not understand it, and I fear what it could mean. They were to be separated." He left town the next morning and never returned. In the fall of 1849, the Graves family decided the boys needed structure. Silas, the quieter of the two, was sent to live with a cousin in Tennessee to apprentice under a blacksmith. Elijah stayed behind to help with the farm. What happened next is what cemented the story into legend. On the night of Silas's departure, Elijah fell ill. So ill he nearly died. He claimed he couldn't breathe, clutched at his chest, and screamed Silas's name until his voice broke. Silas, according to letters sent from Tennessee, never made it to the blacksmith. He was found by the roadside the next morning, unconscious, with his palms blistered, as if he'd been holding fire. They were brought back together, and the illness vanished. The last confirmed sighting of the twins was in 1854. They were both 20 years old and still living with the Graves family, though mostly in the woods. They hunted together, spoke little to others, and were often seen walking silently side by side, even in storm or snow. One morning in late October, just before dawn, Malcolm Graves found a note on the kitchen table in perfect handwriting. "We must go now. Don't look for us. We are not meant to stay." They were never seen again. Search parties combed the woods, the river, the hills. Nothing. No clothes, no tracks, no bodies. The only sign was a pair of footprints, identical in size, leading into the dense thickets near Old Elk Ridge. But the footprints never came out. For decades, stories of the twins lingered in Mill Creek Hollow. Children dared each other to walk the old trails where the Whitlocks once roamed. Some claimed to hear whispers in the wind. Others swore they saw two shadowy figures standing in the fog, just out of reach. But beyond the myth, their story became something else, a lesson. The mystery of Silas and Elijah isn't just about the unexplained. It's about the unbreakable, the connection between souls, the unseen threads that bind us, the power of love that surpasses understanding, and the strange, sacred truth that not all miracles are made to be understood. Science could not explain them, but their legacy of connection, of pain shared and burdens halved, continues to whisper to those willing to believe in something greater than logic. Certainly, here's an expanded version of the incident at the schoolhouse. Section from your story, written in approximately 700 words with vivid detail, emotional depth, and a realistic yet mysterious tone that matches the rest of the narrative. The tiny log schoolhouse that served Mill Creek Hollow in the 1830s was more than a place for learning. It was the only place where young minds gathered under one roof in those woods. It sat at the edge of a sunless clearing, its windows fogged in winter, and its roof patchy from years of storms. Built from rough, hewn timber and warmed only by a single iron stove, it was a quiet haven in a town where work came before education. It was in this modest building that the Whitlock twins, Silas and Elijah, first made their mark on the wider community. They were only 9 years old when their mother Lydia enrolled them. That spring, the air still carried a chill, and the land, having just shaken off its frost, smelled of damp pine and soil. The school's teacher, Miss Catherine Hale, was a young woman from Virginia who'd taken the job out of a desire to do something meaningful. She had no idea how profoundly the next few weeks would shape her understanding of the human mind, or perhaps the human soul. At first, nothing about the twins seemed especially troubling. They sat in the back row, side by side, their faces unreadable, their eyes wide and still. Unlike the other children who fidgeted and whispered when her back was turned, Silas and Elijah barely moved. They watched not just her, but each child in the room. It was unnerving, like being studied by two silent judges. The first incident occurred in early April. Miss Hale had decided to separate the boys for the first time since they'd started. She wanted to observe them individually, to determine if their learning styles differed. She placed Silas at the far right of the room, next to the window, and Elijah at the opposite end, near the door. The result was nearly catastrophic. Within minutes, Elijah began trembling. His hands clutched the sides of the bench until his knuckles turned white. Then, without warning, his nose began to bleed. A slow trickle at first, then a torrent that soaked his collar. Silas, who hadn't been touched or spoken to, suddenly slumped forward, his head hitting the desk with a dull thud. He had fainted. The classroom erupted. Children screamed, some ran. Miss Hale rushed to Elijah first, holding a cloth to his face, then turned to find Silas's pulse weak but steady. She later wrote in her journal, it was as though pain had passed from one body to the other, 2 candles burning from the same wick. She sent both boys home that day, but the strangeness didn't end there. 2 days later, she attempted to quiz the class in arithmetic. She asked a question aloud: if Thomas has 3 chickens and trades 1 for 2 goats, how many animals does he have in total? And was startled when both boys raised their hands at the exact same moment. Not strange, perhaps, until she realized she hadn't assigned them any arithmetic yet. None. She had planned to introduce it the following week. She asked them gently, "How did you know the answer?" Elijah smiled and looked at Silas. Silas didn't speak, but stared blankly at the blackboard. Elijah replied, "We don't know how we know, we just do." From then on, Miss Hale kept detailed records. The boys would mimic each other's handwriting without ever seeing the other write. One day, she blindfolded Elijah and asked him to draw a tree. In the same moment, on the opposite side of the room, Silas drew an identical tree down to the crooked limb and knotted roots. But the final incident, the one that led to their eventual removal from the school, was the most disturbing. A classmate, a boy named Abram Collins, had taken to teasing Silas during recess. He would mock his silence, call him Ghost Boy, and throw stones at his feet. One day, Abram snuck behind Silas and shoved him into a puddle. Elijah, who had been across the yard helping Miss Hale carry a bucket of water, screamed and dropped the bucket. He clutched his chest, gasping, and collapsed onto the ground. Silas stood slowly, eyes blank, face pale. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Abram's left hand, his throwing hand, broke in 3 places that same evening. There was no explanation, no fall, no injury. He simply woke up screaming, his fingers twisted unnaturally. Doctors said it was impossible for the fractures to have happened in his sleep, but those who knew the twins didn't call it a coincidence. Miss Hale, trembling, wrote her final words about them in her journal. They are joined by something older than blood, something that watches through them, and I fear it watches us too. The Whitlock twins never returned to school after that. But the tale of what happened in that schoolhouse spread far and wide, and those who heard it would never look at twins or the limits of human connection the same way again. It was October 8th, 1843, a Sunday evening like any other in Mill Creek Hollow. The leaves had already turned to their final flames of red and gold, and the wind had a bite that whispered winter's name. The Whitlock cabin sat in solitude across the creek from the rest of the village, nestled in a wooded bend at the base of Ridge Hill. Lydia Whitlock had always liked the quiet. She said the trees kept secrets better than people ever could. The boys, Silas and Elijah, were just 9 years old, but everyone knew they were not like other children. The stories had begun to spread, strange happenings at school, impossible connections, and the eerie feeling folks got when the boys were near. But no one expected what would happen that night. As the sun dipped below the hills and darkness claimed the valley, smoke began to rise. At first, it was mistaken for fog or a neighbor's chimney. But soon, flames danced above the trees like specters, wild and furious. The glow in the sky painted the clouds orange and gold, and the sound, though the sound, was not just of burning wood. It was screaming, one voice, a woman's. By the time neighbors arrived, the cabin was engulfed in an inferno. The roof had collapsed inward. The stone chimney, blackened and cracked, stood like a gravestone in the fire's heart. No one dared approach. The heat was too intense. The smell of pine wood, oil, and something else, something human, hung in the air. Lydia Whitlock never made it out, but the twins were nowhere to be found. Panic swept through the town like lightning. Men formed search parties with lanterns, splitting into groups to comb the woods, fearing the worst. But what they found was something that chilled even the most hardened among them. Nearly 3 miles from the burning cabin, across the cold waters of Mill Creek and deep into the thickets near Rock Hollow, the boys were discovered, standing side by side in the middle of a field, dressed only in their thin nightclothes. Barefoot, soaked in rain, their skin was cold, but their eyes were calm. They didn't cry, they didn't scream, they didn't even look surprised. It was old Miss Edna Brewster who approached first, wrapping them in a wool blanket and whispering prayers over them. "What happened, boys?" she asked. "Why did you run?" Silas looked down. Elijah blinked once, then whispered, "We heard Mama's voice. She told us to run, so we did." "You heard her voice?" she asked again. Elijah nodded slowly. "She was in our heads." That line became a haunting phrase repeated for years in hushed tones at family tables and around campfires. She was in our heads. The next morning, the men returned to the ashes. The fire had burned hot and fast, fueled by oil that Lydia used for lanterns and heating. They found the remains of her body near the hearth, curled, arms around something. The remains were too damaged to know what she held. But what struck them most was this: the front door was open, not burned or unopen, and just beyond it, untouched by flame, were 2 sets of small footprints in the dirt, side by side, facing away from the house. Like they'd walked out calmly, before the fire ever started. The community tried to make sense of it. Some believed Lydia had somehow sacrificed herself to save her sons. Others whispered darker things, that the fire was no accident, that the boys had somehow known, or worse, caused it, but no evidence of arson was ever found, no fuel trail, no signs of foul play, just ashes and questions. The town preacher, Reverend Amos Fairchild, said during Lydia's funeral sermon, "There are things God has not chosen to explain to us, and perhaps the Whitlock family walks closer to those mysteries than the rest of us." After the burial, no family came forward to claim the boys. The only relatives they had were distant and unreachable. So Malcolm and Harriet Graves, a farming couple from just outside town who had recently lost a son of their own, took them in. The boys didn't speak of the fire again. Not once, not even in whispers to each other, but they never set foot near the old cabin's ruins, not even when they were older. They avoided the path through Ridge Hill like it carried death itself. Still, one thing was clear to everyone who saw them after that night. Something in them had changed. Silas became even quieter, his stare deeper, as if he saw through people. Elijah stopped smiling altogether. And from that day forward, the two never slept in separate rooms again. Not once, because somewhere deep down they knew the truth that others wouldn't speak aloud. They hadn't just survived the fire. They had been pulled from it by something unseen, something no science, no sermon, and no story could ever fully explain. After the fire, the Whitlock twins became the town's quiet obsession. They were no longer just peculiar boys who moved and breathed like mirrored shadows. They were now survivors of something no one could explain. Malcolm and Harriet Graves had taken them in out of compassion, but what grew within their home over the next few years was more than they bargained for. It wasn't just grief that lingered in the boys' eyes. It was something else, something older. By the time Silas and Elijah turned 12, those closest to them began to notice things that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or child's play. It started with language. One evening, as the family sat around the hearth reading scripture, as they often did to pass the long candle-lit night, Silas, who had rarely spoken aloud since the fire, read from the Gospel of Matthew in perfect Latin. No one in the house had ever spoken Latin. Harriet, startled, asked where he had learned such a thing. He blinked slowly and said, "It was in the book." "But the book is in English," she replied. Elijah, without looking up, added, "We heard it before, in a dream." From that night on, strange expressions would slip from their mouths. Once, while helping Malcolm mend a fence, Elijah muttered a phrase under his breath that sounded like an incantation. Malcolm later wrote it down phonetically and brought it to the traveling pastor, who identified the words as an old form of ancient Greek, words used in early medical texts to describe wounds of the soul. These weren't tricks. The boys had never been taught these languages. They had never even left Mill Creek Hollow, but their knowledge didn't stop at language. They began to demonstrate understanding of things far beyond their years. At 13, Silas drew a complex diagram in the dirt using a stick, geometric patterns layered with precision. When Malcolm asked what it was, Silas replied, "It's the way trees speak underground. Roots remember each other." Harriet, curious and increasingly uneasy, began keeping a journal. Over months, she recorded dozens of moments that defied explanation, the twins finishing one another's sentences not in words, but in glances, Elijah sketching symbols that resembled ancient alchemical marks, Silas predicting a frost 2 weeks before the weather turned, when skies were still warm and clear. But the most unsettling moment came in the spring of 1847. Charlotte Graves, the eldest of Malcolm and Harriet's 3 daughters, had always been close with the boys, especially Elijah. She was 17 then, and often helped them with their chores and studies. One evening, she came into the house pale and shaking. She had found Silas kneeling beside a squirrel's carcass in the woods. His eyes were closed. His hands were hovering above the animal. He was whispering. She told her mother. Not to God, to something else, and when he opened his eyes, the squirrel twitched. It wasn't dead anymore. It ran off. Harriet tried to dismiss it as shock, imagination, or childish exaggeration. But a week later, Charlotte fell ill with fever. Her skin burned, her hands trembled, and her mind began to fray. She spoke of voices in the walls and shadows that knew her name. Doctors were brought in from neighboring towns. None could find a cause. One said it was hysteria. Another blamed the water, but Harriet feared something deeper. Desperate, she confronted the boys. "What have you done to her?" she asked, tears welling in her eyes. Elijah stepped forward. She saw what she wasn't ready to see, the lines between things where one world touches another. Harriet slapped him. It was the first and only time she ever struck a child. Silas didn't flinch. Elijah didn't cry. Instead, he gently touched her hand and said, "You dreamed of drowning last night. You woke up crying but never told anyone. That's why you're afraid of the water pump." Harriet staggered back, speechless. She had dreamed exactly that. From that day on, fear crept into the Graves household. The boys still did their chores, still attended Sunday service, still answered kindly when spoken to, but their presence, once tragic, once pitied, now carried a strange gravity. Like they were not just boys anymore, but conduits. They were never cruel, never malicious. In fact, the strangest thing of all was their gentleness. They would stop to help a limping dog. They would sing lullabies to the younger Graves girls on stormy nights. But still, that unnatural knowledge lingered like a storm cloud behind their eyes. Reverend Amos once visited the home to bless the children, sensing something off. As he placed his hand on Elijah's head and began to pray, Silas, who had been in the barn, called out the rest of the prayer, word for word in perfect Hebrew. The Reverend left that night and never returned. It was no longer a question of whether the boys were special. The only question that remained now was, what kind of special were they, and who, or what had given them that knowledge? Word of the Whitlock twins had begun to travel well beyond the ridges and valleys of Mill Creek Hollow. Farmers told tales of 2 boys who could speak forgotten tongues. Merchants in the next county whispered about the children who felt each other's pain from miles apart. The stories, impossible and spine-chilling, reached the ears of a man who had spent his career chasing the unexplained under the guise of science. Dr. Horace Tillingham was no ordinary physician. Trained in Boston and educated in Europe, he was part doctor, part philosopher, part skeptic. He had spent years studying neurological oddities, twins in particular. To him, tales like those surrounding the Whitlocks were rarely supernatural. They were misunderstood anomalies, misdiagnosed phenomena, nothing more than illusions hiding in folklore. He saw himself as the one who could separate the myth from the measurable. So in the autumn of 1847, he arrived in Mill Creek Hollow under the pretense of visiting an old patient. In truth, he came for the boys. He was tall, sharply dressed in a gray wool coat, and carried a worn leather bag filled with instruments few in the town recognized. The Graves family was hesitant at first, Harriet especially, but after several gentle reassurances and Malcolm's insistence that answers might help, they agreed to let the doctor spend 3 days with the boys. Dr. Tillingham was cordial but clinical. He introduced himself to Silas and Elijah with a warm smile and a firm handshake. The boys, now 13, stared at him in silence. When he offered to speak alone with one, they declined. They would not be separated. Day 1 began with simple tests, reflex checks, vision exams, heartbeat monitoring. The boys passed with ease. Then he moved on to more complicated evaluations, memory recall, logic puzzles, language recognition. That's when things began to shift. He opened a Latin text and pointed to a sentence. "Can you read this?" Silas read it aloud flawlessly. So did Elijah. At the exact same time. "Do you know what it means?" the doctor asked. "It says that which is broken can still remember its shape," Elijah replied. Silas added, "And the light remembers the flame." It was a poetic translation, too poetic for boys their age. The doctor's pen scribbled notes faster than ever. That night, Dr. Tillingham sat at the hearth with Malcolm, Harriet, and Charlotte, shaking his head slowly. "They're remarkable, that much is certain, but I haven't found anything truly unexplainable yet. Exceptional memory, advanced cognition, linguistic talent, yes, but nothing supernatural." Harriet wasn't convinced. "You haven't seen them when they dream." Day 2 focused on what the doctor called transference response. He wanted to see how deeply the boys' supposed connection ran. He asked Elijah to sit outside while Silas remained inside with him. As Elijah waited, Dr. Tillingham pricked Silas's palm with a small needle. From the window, they heard Elijah scream. The doctor ran outside, stunned. Elijah was pale and shaking, clutching his left hand, identical to the one Silas had been pricked. There was no wound on Elijah's palm, but his pulse was elevated, his breathing shallow, his eyes glassy. That could still be coincidence. Dr. Tillingham muttered, "Psychosomatic reaction. Maybe he anticipated pain." Day 3 shattered that certainty. Dr. Tillingham took the boys to the barn, where he drew a large chalk circle on a wooden beam. He handed the chalk to Silas and instructed him to draw something, anything, on one side of the barn. Meanwhile, Elijah, blindfolded, stood in the far corner, back turned. Silas drew a strange spiral pattern intersected with geometric shapes. When Elijah was given a stick and asked to draw anything at all in the dirt, he paused, then moved slowly, deliberately. The same spiral emerged. Identical angles, identical lines. Tillingham's hands trembled. That evening, he requested a final test. He asked the boys if he could lightly sedate one of them to monitor the other's physiological reactions. Surprisingly, the twins agreed. On one condition, they must hold hands while the test was done. The doctor consented. Silas volunteered. As the mild sedative entered his arm, his eyes fluttered. Heartbeat slowed. Breath deepened. Elijah, meanwhile, was awake, yet his own heartbeat slowed in perfect sync. Dr. Tillingham checked the equipment twice, then 3 times. As Silas fell into sleep, Elijah whispered something so quiet, the doctor barely heard. "He's dreaming of fire again." "Excuse me," Tillingham asked. Elijah looked at him, eyes distant. "He's back in the fire the night our mother died." Dr. Tillingham dropped his pen. The next morning, he left Mill Creek Hollow before sunrise. He left no summary for the family, no farewell, just a sealed envelope placed on the grave's table. Inside was a single page. "In all my years I've studied the brain, the body, and the soul, but I have never encountered what I saw in those boys. They are not a shared mind. They are one soul living twice. I dare not return." He never did. And from that moment on, the scientific world stopped trying to explain the Whitlock twins, because even science knows when it's reached its edge. By the time Silas and Elijah turned 15, the Graves household was no longer the same. What had once been an act of compassion, taking in 2 orphaned boys, had become a daily burden soaked in uncertainty. Malcolm still defended them. He called them special, and insisted they were simply misunderstood. But Harriet had grown weary, not out of malice, but from fear. Fear of what they knew, fear of what they felt. and fear of what that knowledge might cost her daughters. She had tried to love them as her own, truly. But there were moments when she would wake in the middle of the night and find them standing outside her door, just standing, never knocking, never speaking, just there together, waiting. She began sleeping with a Bible beneath her pillow. Then came the incident with the animals. One morning, the family awoke to find every chicken in the coop lying motionless on the ground. Not dead, but completely unresponsive, eyes open, still breathing, but stiff, frozen, as if caught in some trance. The local vet had no explanation. He blamed bad grain, but Silas, when asked if he'd seen anything the night before, only muttered, "They were listening to something we couldn't hear." That night, Harriet told Malcolm they couldn't keep the boys much longer. They need structure. She insisted they need separation. Maybe it's the closeness that feeds this power. Malcolm didn't want to agree. But even he had noticed it. As the boys aged, their bond didn't weaken. It intensified. Their silence spoke volumes. They no longer needed words. They moved like reflections. They would stop walking at the same moment, turn their heads to the same sound, even blink in rhythm. So with heavy hearts, the Graves arranged to send Silas away to live with a cousin of Malcolm's in Tennessee, a blacksmith, a hard-working man who could teach him a trade and give him space to become his own person. Elijah would remain on the farm. When the boys were told, they did not protest. They simply looked at each other. Elijah whispered, "I'll still hear you." Silas nodded, "I know." On the morning of Silas's departure, the sky was thick with fog. A covered wagon waited at the edge of the road, ready to take him south. He wore a hand-stitched coat, boots that didn't quite fit, and a satchel Harriet had packed with food, soap, and a small leather Bible. The twins stood in silence for a long time before Silas climbed aboard. They did not hug. They did not speak. They just looked. A single, long gaze that held more than words could carry. As the wagon creaked away, Elijah stood barefoot in the dew-drenched field, watching until the fog swallowed the road. That evening, Elijah collapsed. He was feeding the goats when he suddenly screamed, a blood-curdling sound that sent Harriet running. He clutched his chest, gasping. His face turned white as chalk. "He's gone too far," he cried. "I can't feel him. I can't feel him." They laid him in bed, feverish and shivering. He couldn't sleep. He kept murmuring Silas's name, begging for him to come back. His pulse raced uncontrollably. His breath came in shallow bursts. No amount of water, no prayer, no medicine calmed him. Harriet feared he was dying. Meanwhile, in Tennessee, Silas never reached the blacksmith. He was found the next morning by a farmer 2 miles from the state border, collapsed beside the road, unconscious and burned. His palms were blistered, his lips were cracked. When the farmer tried to rouse him, Silas awoke only to whisper, "He's still calling me. I have to go back." The man, confused and frightened, brought Silas to a nearby doctor who treated the burns and offered to contact his family. But Silas refused to stay. He took only a canteen and a loaf of bread and walked north without another word. 2 days later, he returned to Mill Creek Hollow. When Elijah saw him from the farmhouse window, he bolted through the door, barefoot, fever gone. They met in the middle of the field, and they simply stood. No embrace, no tears, only peace. That night, the Graves found both boys asleep in the same bed, like when they were children. Silas's blisters were nearly healed. Elijah's color had returned. Neither spoke of the separation again. But something had changed in both of them, as if the brief rupture had carved new space inside them. Space not just for pain, but for something else, resolve. From that day forward, they were never separated again. Not for a day, not for a chore, not for sleep, not even for church. They had been 2 halves torn apart, and they had paid the price for that tearing. Some in town said it was unnatural. Others called it miraculous. But everyone who saw them afterward agreed on one thing. Whatever bound the Whitlock twins was not of this world, and to break it was to break the very rhythm of their lives. By the time Silas and Elijah turned 17, the town of Mill Creek Hollow had come to a quiet agreement, one no one dared speak aloud, but all silently abided by. Leave the twins alone. There had been too many incidents. Too many whispers, a teacher who forgot how to write her own name after reprimanding them, a sheriff's deputy who tried to separate them again and broke out in boils the next morning, screaming that their eyes had fire in them. And the graveyard caretaker who claimed he saw them standing in the churchyard one night, barefoot, staring at the ground where no grave had been dug. And the next day, a coffin was lowered there into a plot no one remembered purchasing. The town didn't blame the boys, not really. They just knew something was different about them. Something no sermon, no doctor, and no law could fix. Malcolm aged 10 years in two. Harriet never spoke above a whisper. The younger Graves girls learned not to ask questions, and the twins, well, they grew quiet. Not in a sinister way, but in a distant one, like they were slowly stepping out of this world, 1 foot at a time. Then came the drought. The summer of 1834 was bone dry. The crops shriveled, wells ran low, animals grew sick, dust sat in the air like ash. It was as if the land itself had gone hollow. That's when people began to see them again, not just around town, but in places they shouldn't be. Silas was spotted walking the edge of Widow Henry's fields at midnight, staring into the stars, mouthing words no one could hear. Elijah was seen near the old mine shafts, ones that had been boarded up for years, just standing there unmoving, with his hand pressed to the wood as if listening. Some said the twins were trying to fix the land, others believed they were causing the curse, but no one said it out loud until the fire. It began in the woods behind the schoolhouse, where the pines were so dry they crackled in the breeze. The flames moved fast, hungry and erratic, leaping over the creek bed like it didn't exist. By the time it reached the first home, people were screaming, buckets were thrown, prayers shouted, horses untied. Chaos, and through it all, the twins were nowhere to be found. Malcolm ran through the smoke, calling their names. Harriet fell to her knees, clutching her Bible to her chest. The fire reached the edge of the Graves farm, and then it stopped. Just like that, no wind change, no rainfall, just halted as if a line had been drawn that the fire dared not cross, and when the smoke cleared they found something in the fields, 2 sets of clothes. Perfectly folded, 2 pairs of boots, 2 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, still warm to the touch, but the boys were gone, no footprints in the dirt, no sign of struggle, just silence. For weeks, search parties combed the land. They dragged the creek. They sent riders out to neighboring counties. Preachers held vigils. Children were kept indoors, but there was nothing, not a single trace, only stories. One farmer claimed he saw 2 figures on the ridge at sunset, silhouetted against the light, holding hands like shadows burned into the sky. A little girl from the edge of town said she dreamed of them, whispering that they weren't gone, just further. An old midwife swore she heard music from the woods every night since they vanished, soft like humming in perfect harmony. Eventually, life moved on. The Graves farm was sold, the church repainted. A new schoolhouse was built, this time of stone. But the mystery of the twins lingered. Generations later, the story was still told around campfires in old journals, passed down like a riddle no one could solve. 2 boys born of tragedy, raised in silence. Separated by fear, reunited by something not even science could name, and then gone, not dead, not buried, just gone. Some said they were angels sent down for a time only to be called back. Others whispered that they were cursed souls, taken by the very force they tried to outrun. But the most common theory, the one whispered by the oldest folks, the ones with cloudy eyes and long memories, was this: the world was never built to hold them. They weren't meant to grow old. They weren't meant to follow rules or be studied or fixed. They were born with a bond stronger than bone, louder than thought, and deeper than time. And once the world had taken all it could from them, its fear, its cruelty, its fire, it simply let them go into the fog, into the sky, or into some place not meant for us. To this day, no one knows for certain. But if you ever find yourself alone in Mill Creek Hollow, when the fog rolls in thick and the air smells like smoke, listen closely. You might hear them, still walking, still whispering, still together. Years passed. Mill Creek Hollow changed as all towns do. Roads were paved. The chapel was rebuilt in brick. Children played where fields once caught fire, and a new schoolhouse taught arithmetic where the old one had burned. But something in the air remained the same, something quiet, something watchful. No one spoke of the twins anymore. Not openly, not in classrooms, not in sermons. The Graves family name faded into the dust of old records and forgotten land deeds. But the story, their story lived, not because people believed it, but because they felt it. It showed in the way children never wandered far into the woods, in how families still lit lanterns in the windows during storms, and in how every now and then someone left two folded shirts by the church steps, as though expecting someone, or something, to return. The property once known as the Graves farm eventually passed into the hands of a distant cousin who never came to claim it. Nature swallowed the house whole. Trees pierced through the floorboards, vines clutched the chimney like fingers, and the porch collapsed inward like a mouth too tired to speak. But the attic remained intact. And inside it, under a sheet of dust older than any living soul, sat a wooden box. It wasn't found until 1899 by a surveyor marking new boundaries for the railroad company. The man had no reason to climb into the attic, but he said something drew him there. He never explained what. He simply said, "I felt a pull, like something unfinished." Inside the box were things, simple things, yet they carried weight. A cloth doll with mismatched button eyes. A drawing, crudely done in charcoal, of two boys holding hands beneath a tree. A Bible, pages marked and worn with the name Harriet Graves written in faded ink. Two smooth stones polished by hand wrapped in twine, and a journal, not written by Harriet, not by Malcolm, but by the boys. Only a few pages were legible. The ink had bled and faded with time, but what remained was enough to stir something in every person who read it. Sometimes I feel like Elijah can hear what I'm thinking even when I'm quiet, like my fear doesn't belong to me alone. Silas says he sees light around people when they lie. I think that's why he doesn't talk much anymore. They tried to make us different, but we were never meant to be separate. I think some souls come in pairs. The journal ended abruptly. No farewell, no sign of planning or departure, just one final line: if we go together. The artifacts were taken to a local archive, but strange things began to happen to those who handled them. Misplaced memories, dreams of fire, unshakable sadness. Eventually, the curator sealed the box in a vault and declared it a closed case of local folklore, but people still asked about it because something about it felt too real to be legend, too detailed to be dismissed, and too sacred to forget. Over time, the mystery of the twins transformed into something else, a lesson. People began to see the story not just as a chilling tale of the unknown, but as a mirror. A reflection of how society treats what it cannot understand, how fear can twist love into punishment, and how trying to control the unexplainable often leads to the very tragedies we wish to avoid. The twins in their silence had said more than most people say in a lifetime. They showed that some bonds defy reason, that some souls are too pure or too strange for the world's expectations, and maybe, just maybe, that's not something to be feared. Maybe that's something to be honored. To this day, on the anniversary of the fire, a few residents still walk out to the edge of the woods. Some leave small tokens, a drawing, a doll, a stone. Others come to feel the stillness, to listen. Not for voices, but for a presence, because while the boys disappeared, what they left behind never did, not just in relics or ruins, but in a town that still remembers, in a world learning to make room for what it cannot explain. And in every person who ever felt like they were born different, like they didn't belong, like they were one half of something deeper, they find hope in the legend of Silas and Elijah, not because the boys vanished, but because they endured together until the end and maybe beyond it.